In the reading room of the New South Wales State Archives in Sydney, there exists a series of bound volumes that most researchers walk past without stopping. They sit on metal shelving in climate-controlled storage, their spines marked with dates ranging from 1856 to 1901, their pages filled with the kind of administrative minutiae that typically interests only genealogists and demographic historians. These are the colonial birth registers, the official record of every child born in the Australian colonies during the second half of the 19th century. The pages are ruled into columns: date of birth, name of child, name of father, occupation of father, place of birth, name of mother. The handwriting varies from clerk to clerk, some entries crisp and confident, others cramped and difficult to pass. The ink has faded to brown in places, and some pages show water damage from a flood in 1927. The volumes measure approximately 14 inches tall and 10 inches wide, bound in boards covered with worn cloth that has darkened with age and handling. This essay examines a specific pattern in these registers: entries from the 1880s, where the mother's name column contains institutional designations rather than personal names, or remains blank. I argue that this pattern, while unusual and worthy of systematic study, can be explained through documented features of colonial Australian society without requiring extraordinary hypotheses. The pattern is real and deserves careful investigation, but the available evidence does not currently support claims that it represents something fundamentally different from known historical processes of illegitimacy, social stigma, and institutional child welfare practice in 19th century settler colonies. The pattern itself is straightforward to describe. In birth registers from the 1880s across multiple Australian colonies, some entries show the mother's name column either blank, marked with a dash, or filled with institutional designations rather than personal names. Examples from registers I have examined include Melbourne Foundling Hospital, Benevolent Asylum Sydney, Industrial School Parramatta, and Female Factory Cascades. These institutional names appear in the column designated for the mother's identity, not in the place of birth column, which exists separately and typically contains specific addresses or suburb names. A registrar in 1885 was trained to distinguish between a person and a location. The place of birth column exists to record where the birth occurred. The mother's name column exists to record the identity of the woman who gave birth. When an institutional name appears in the latter column, it signals something about how the clerk understood or was instructed to handle cases where maternal identity was unknown, withheld, or considered administratively irrelevant. The most common explanation for blank or missing maternal names is well documented in the historical literature on colonial Australia. The society of the 1880s retained demographic features from its convict origins, including gender imbalances in remote areas and higher rates of illegitimate births than contemporary Britain. Illegitimacy rates in colonial Australia during this period ranged from 8 to 12%, depending on the colony and decade, compared to roughly 5 to 7% in England during the same years. These are aggregate figures drawn from published vital statistics for the colonies, available in the annual reports of registrars general held in state archives. The social stigma attached to unmarried motherhood was severe, and women had strong incentives to avoid having their names recorded in official documents that might later expose them to public shame, loss of employment, or legal consequences regarding custody or maintenance. Registrars Faced with mothers who refused to identify themselves or fathers who provided incomplete information, sometimes left the mother's column empty rather than record information they could not verify or felt unauthorized to compel. This explanation accounts for most instances of blank maternal names in the general population of births. The institutional designations require additional context, but not necessarily a different category of explanation. When a woman gave birth in a foundling hospital, benevolent asylum, or industrial school, and either refused to provide her name or had already been admitted to the institution under circumstances that made her identity uncertain or deliberately obscured, the registrar faced a practical problem. The register required an entry for every birth that occurred within the registration district. The column for mother's name could not be left entirely blank without the appearance of clerical error or incomplete record keeping. In the absence of a verifiable personal name, the clerk wrote what he knew with certainty: the institutional location associated with the birth. This practice treated the institution as a kind of corporate identity, standing in for an unknown individual, similar to how foundling hospitals in London and Paris during the same period sometimes registered abandoned infants under institutional names or placeholder designations when no parental information was available. Foundling hospitals across Europe had developed elaborate systems for recording abandoned infants without maternal identification. The Hospital of the Innocents in Florence used token systems where mothers left half of a split coin or medal with the infant, keeping the other half as proof of identity if they later sought to reclaim the child. The record kept the token description, but not the mother's name. The Foundling Hospital in London, established in 1739, developed a registration system that assigned numbers to infants and recorded detailed descriptions of the clothing and tokens left with them, but maternal names were recorded only when voluntarily provided, which was rare. These European precedents established that institutional child welfare could function without maternal identification, and colonial Australian institutions operated within this broader Atlantic world of institutional practice. The appearance of female factory cascades in 1885 registers, despite the institution having closed as a convict facility in 1856, requires explanation, but does not necessarily indicate anything anomalous. The female factory was not a single building, but a complex of structures that remained in use after 1856 for various purposes, including as a refugee for destitute women and a lying-in hospital. The Tasmanian government repurposed the buildings rather than demolishing them, and the site continued to house women and children under different administrative arrangements. The name female factory persisted in local usage and in some official documents as a geographic designation for the area and the buildings, even after the formal convict institution had been reorganized. This kind of toponymic persistence is extremely common in institutional history. Similarly, the Parramatta Female Factory, which ceased functioning as a convict institution in 1848, continued to operate in modified form as a refuge and asylum for destitute women, and the buildings remained in use for related purposes. The name remained in vernacular use and appeared in official correspondence throughout the second half of the 19th century. When a clerk in 1885 wrote female factory in a birth register, he was most likely using a colloquial or archaic term that still carried meaning for local residents and administrators, not referring to a functioning convict institution in its original form. This is a commonplace pattern in institutional history. Names persist long after the institutions they originally designated have changed function or closed entirely. The University of Paris continued to be called the Sorbonne long after the original Collège de Sorbonne ceased to exist as a separate entity. Oxford colleges retain names of medieval benefactors whose original foundations were reorganized centuries ago. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris has operated continuously since the 7th century, but the institution bearing that name in 1885 had almost nothing in common with its medieval predecessor except location and charitable purpose. Bureaucratic language is conservative and often lags behind institutional reality by decades. Clerks use terminology they inherited from predecessors, which reflected older organizational structures and changed their language only slowly as new terms entered official use. To assess whether the pattern of institutional names in maternal columns represents something requiring extraordinary explanation, we need to establish baseline frequencies and compare them to what would be expected given known features of colonial society. This is where the available evidence becomes limiting. I have not conducted a comprehensive survey of all birth registers for all Australian colonies for the 1880s. Such a survey would require months of archival work across multiple state archives in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Hobart, and Perth. It would need to establish consistent coding criteria for what counts as an institutional designation versus other forms of incomplete or unusual entries, and it would need to distinguish between different types of institutional names: charitable institutions, government facilities, hospitals, and vernacular place names. Without this baseline data, claims about the frequency or statistical significance of the pattern remain impressionistic rather than empirical. What can be said with confidence based on published demographic histories of colonial Australia is that institutional childbirth and institutional child-rearing were both more common in the Australian colonies than in Britain during the same period. By 1880, New South Wales maintained state-funded or state-supervised institutions housing over 4,000 children classified as orphaned, destitute, or neglected, according to the annual report of the State Children's Relief Board. Victoria had similar numbers, with approximately 3,800 children in institutional care in 1885, according to the Victorian Yearbook. South Australia showed proportionally higher rates of institutionalisation relative to its smaller population, with approximately 900 children in institutions serving a colonial population roughly 1/5 the size of New South Wales. These figures come from published government reports and have been cited in historical studies by Shirley Swain and others working on child welfare history. The explanations offered by contemporary observers and later historians for these high institutionalization rates include the disruptions caused by gold rush migration in the 1850s and 1860s, which created a highly mobile population with weak community ties. High mortality rates among working-class adults, particularly in urban areas where infectious disease was endemic, left children orphaned at rates exceeding those in more settled societies. The absence of extended family networks that might absorb orphaned children in villages or tight-knit communities meant that children who lost parents often had no kin available to take them in. Colonial governments made deliberate policy choices that favored institutional solutions over alternatives like boarding out or foster care, partly because institutions seemed more controllable and accountable, partly because they could provide basic education and industrial training that would make children self-supporting, and partly because outdoor relief to families was politically unpopular among taxpayers who feared creating dependency. The high rates of institutionalization mean that a significant number of children in colonial Australia spent their early lives in foundling hospitals, orphanages, and industrial schools. Some of these children were born in these institutions to women who were already residents, either as inmates in the older sense of that term or as temporary residents seeking refuge during pregnancy and childbirth. Protestant rescue homes and Catholic refugees operated throughout the Australian colonies, providing shelter to pregnant, unmarried women in exchange for a period of labour after childbirth. The institutional names in birth registers may simply reflect this demographic reality. Children born in institutions to women whose connection to those institutions was their most salient identity from the perspective of the registrar were recorded with the institution as the maternal identifier, because that was the most stable and verifiable information available. The woman might give a name, but if she left the institution shortly after childbirth, and the institution had no way to verify her identity or track her afterwards, the registrar might reasonably conclude that the institutional location was a more reliable datum than an unverifiable name. A survey conducted by the New South Wales government in 1880 attempted to categorize children in state care by the circumstances of their admission. The resulting report, submitted to the Colonial Secretary and now held in fragmentary form in State Records New South Wales under the series designation NRS 905, attempted to bring order to a chaotic and inconsistent set of local practices. The categories developed for the survey included orphan with both parents deceased, orphan with father deceased and mother living, orphan with mother deceased and father living, deserted by parents, and illegitimate with mother known. There was also a category labeled origin unknown, which functioned as a residual classification for cases that did not fit the other categories or where information was insufficient to make a determination. According to the fragmentary tabulations that survive from this survey, children in the origin unknown category accounted for approximately 11% of the total institutional population in 1880. A follow-up survey conducted in 1885, mentioned in correspondence between the State Children's Relief Board and the Colonial Secretary's Office, found that the percentage had risen to approximately 19%. By 1890, according to a report discussed in parliamentary debates recorded in Hansard, the proportion had reached approximately 23%. These figures are approximate because the original survey documents are incomplete and because different institutions use different classification criteria that were not fully standardized until the 1890s. These rising percentages require careful interpretation. First, we do not have the absolute numbers underlying these percentages for all years, so we cannot determine whether the increase reflects a growing absolute number of children of unknown origin, a stable number against a declining total institutional population, or some combination of factors. If the total institutional population was declining due to increased use of boarding out during this period, which was happening in some colonies, then a stable absolute number of children of unknown origin would show up as a rising percentage. Second, the category origin unknown is an administrative classification, and administrative categories change meaning over time as the criteria for classification shift or as the people doing the classifying apply different standards. What counted as unknown origin in 1880 might have been classified differently in 1890, not because the underlying facts changed, but because the bureaucratic culture or legal requirements changed. The introduction of new administrative forms, the hiring of new staff with different training or directives from central authorities to tighten classification standards could all affect how children were categorized. Third, economic conditions in the Australian colonies deteriorated significantly during the late 1880s and early 1890s, culminating in the severe depression of the 1890s, which brought widespread unemployment, bank failures, and social distress. Economic distress increases rates of child abandonment and family breakdown, which would be expected to increase the proportion of children entering institutions under circumstances that made parental identification difficult or impossible. Women who abandoned infants during economic crises often did so anonymously, precisely to avoid legal liability for child support or criminal prosecution for abandonment. The rising percentage of children classified as origin unknown is entirely consistent with worsening economic conditions and does not require additional explanatory factors beyond those already well documented in the economic and social history of the period. This does not mean the classification is uninteresting or unworthy of further study. It means that before proposing novel explanations, we need to rule out or account for the known factors that would predict exactly this pattern. The principle of parsimony in historical explanation requires that we exhaust ordinary explanations before invoking extraordinary ones, and that we proportion our confidence in explanations to the strength of the evidence supporting them. The claim that no systematic demographic study has traced these patterns is not quite accurate, though it contains an element of truth. Studies of illegitimacy, child welfare, and institutional populations in colonial Australia exist, though they are scattered across different subfields and may not use the specific framing that would highlight the maternal absence pattern as a distinct phenomenon requiring special explanation. The work of historians like Shirley Swain on child welfare institutions, particularly her book on the history of child welfare in Victoria, covers institutional populations and admission categories in considerable detail. Patricia Grimshaw's work on women in colonial Australia addresses illegitimacy and social stigma. Demographic historians, including Hilda Robinson and Charles Price, have worked on colonial vital statistics and registration systems. These scholars have examined much of the evidence that would be relevant to questions about maternal absence in birth registers, though often with different research questions than the ones foregrounded in discussions of maternal absence as a distinct historical problem. The fragmentary nature of research on this specific question is not unusual in historical scholarship. Historical research is cumulative and distributed across many individual projects, each addressing a limited set of questions with finite resources. No single researcher or research team examines every possible question that a body of sources might address. Questions get asked when individual researchers find them interesting, when they connect to broader historiographical debates, when funding is available, and when the necessary sources are accessible. The absence of a comprehensive study of maternal absence patterns in colonial Australian birth registers does not indicate that the question is being suppressed or that it cannot be studied. It indicates that no one has yet assembled the funding, time, and institutional support necessary to conduct such a study, which would be a major undertaking requiring several years of archival work across multiple repositories. The claim that academic funding structures and peer review processes make it impossible to study certain questions overstates the rigidity of these systems. While it is true that unconventional research proposals face more scrutiny, and may have lower success rates than proposals that fit established paradigms. The academic system does fund and publish research that challenges conventional interpretations, particularly when that research is grounded in solid archival work and clearly articulated methodology. A proposal to study unusual patterns in birth registration would need to explain why the pattern is significant, what historical questions it might help answer, what methods would be used to analyze the registers systematically, and how the proposed research would advance understanding beyond what existing studies have already established. These are reasonable requirements for any research proposal, not special obstacles erected to exclude particular topics. The barrier is not categorical exclusion, but the higher evidentiary standard applied to claims that depart from consensus views. This is frustrating for researchers pursuing unconventional questions, but it represents a feature of scholarly practice, not a bug. Science and scholarship advance through a combination of normal puzzle solving within established frameworks and occasional paradigm-challenging innovations, but the latter must meet higher standards of proof precisely because they ask the community to revise settled understandings. The requirement for stronger evidence when making stronger claims is not unique to historical research. It operates across all empirical disciplines and serves to protect the accumulated body of knowledge from erosion by inadequately supported speculations. The suggestion that isotopic analysis of skeletal remains or DNA analysis of bodies buried in institutional cemeteries could resolve questions about the origins and relationships of institutionalized children is technically correct, but overlooks practical and ethical complications. Human remains in Australia are protected by heritage legislation, both at the state and Commonwealth levels, and in cases involving Indigenous remains, by additional laws and cultural protocols developed in response to historical abuses. Non-Indigenous historical remains are also subject to heritage protections that require justification for any invasive study. A proposal to conduct isotopic or genetic analysis of remains from institutional cemeteries would need to demonstrate that the research questions could not be answered through less invasive methods, that the scientific and historical value outweighed the costs and risks, and that appropriate consultation with descendant communities and relevant heritage bodies had occurred. These are not bureaucratic obstacles designed to prevent research. They are ethical requirements developed in response to historical abuses of human remains, particularly but not exclusively Indigenous remains, by researchers who prioritize knowledge production over respect for the dead and their descendants. The history of anthropological and medical research in Australia includes deeply troubling episodes of remains being removed from burial sites without consent, held in museum collections without descendant involvement, and studied in ways that violated the dignity of the deceased and the cultural practices of their communities. The current regulatory framework exists to prevent repetition of those abuses, and any researcher proposing to work with human remains must navigate this framework, which involves time, consultation, and ethical review, but which is not insurmountable for well-designed projects with clear justification. Moreover, isotopic analysis could tell us whether children buried in institutional cemeteries had geographic origins and dietary patterns consistent with local birth versus migration from elsewhere. But it could not tell us whether their mothers were recorded in birth registers or why maternal names might be missing from those registers. A child born locally to a woman who refused to provide her name would show the same isotopic signature as a child born locally to a woman whose name was recorded. The isotopic data would be interesting for questions about institutional diet and child migration patterns, but it would not directly address the administrative question of registration practice. DNA analysis could establish biological relationships among individuals buried in the same cemetery, which might reveal patterns of familial clustering or lack thereof. But again, it could not tell us why administrative records were kept the way they were. If genetic analysis showed that many children buried in an institutional cemetery shared close biological relationships, this would tell us something about the reproductive patterns among the population of women associated with that institution, but it would not explain why registrars chose to write institutional names instead of personal names in maternal columns. If genetic analysis showed little biological relationship among the buried children, this would tell us that they came from diverse maternal lineages, but again, it would not explain registration practice. The questions that skeletal and genetic analysis could answer are not the same questions as why registrars left maternal names blank or used institutional designations. Those are questions about bureaucratic practice, social context, and the administrative logic of registration systems, and they require archival and institutional history methods, not biological methods. The assertion that no one has conducted systematic archival comparison across colonial registration practices is testable and, as far as I can determine from published literature, partially correct. Comprehensive comparative studies of registration practices across all Australian colonies for the entire 19th century do not exist, though there are studies covering individual colonies or specific time periods. Janet McCalman's work on Melbourne uses birth, marriage, and death registers extensively. Michael Cannon's social histories of Victoria draw on vital statistics. Studies of individual institutions like the Neglected Children's Department or the State Children's Relief Board examine admission and discharge records that intersect with birth registration. But a systematic comparison of how different colonial registrars general instructed their clerks to handle cases of unknown or unwilling to be identified mothers, whether these instructions changed over time, and whether practices differed significantly between colonies, has not been published. This kind of study is entirely feasible within the scope of a doctoral dissertation or a funded research project. The registration manuals and instruction circulars issued by registrars general survive in state archives. Correspondence between central registration offices and district registrars sometimes discusses problem cases and how to handle them. Annual reports of registrars general discuss administrative challenges, including incomplete information. A researcher could trace how each colony developed its registration procedures, how those procedures were communicated to clerks, and how they handled edge cases. This would require perhaps 6 months to a year of archival work across multiple state archives, time-consuming, but not impossible. The reason this has not been done is not suppression, but the more mundane reality that most historical research is driven by the specific interests of individual researchers, the availability of funding for archival travel, the accidents of which questions seem interesting or important at a given moment, and the practical constraints of what can be accomplished within the time frame of a dissertation or a research grant. Many researchable questions remain unresearched, simply because no one has yet chosen to research them, not because anyone is preventing their investigation. The landscape of historical scholarship is full of gaps, not because those gaps are defended, but because the number of possible questions vastly exceeds the number of historians working to answer them. The blank spaces in maternal name columns are real. They appear in the registers I have examined and in those reported by other researchers who have worked with these sources. The institutional designations appear as well. The pattern is unusual enough to warrant investigation, and a systematic study quantifying its frequency, geographic distribution, and temporal variation would be valuable. But investigation means careful archival work, systematic sampling, comparative analysis, and attention to the full range of explanations that might account for the observed patterns. It does not mean assuming that unusual necessarily means inexplicable by ordinary historical processes, or that the absence of existing comprehensive research on a specific question means the question cannot be answered by existing methods. Colonial Australia was a society with high rates of illegitimacy, significant gender imbalances in frontier regions, large institutional populations of children, strong social stigma against unmarried motherhood, and bureaucratic systems that were still developing standardized practices during the 1880s. These features, documented in considerable detail by demographic and social historians over several decades of research, predict that birth registers would show patterns of incomplete or unusual maternal information, including blank columns and institutional designations. The prediction matches the observation. Additional explanation is needed only if the observed pattern differs significantly in frequency or character from what these known factors would predict, and establishing that requires the kind of systematic quantitative analysis that compares observed frequencies to expected frequencies under plausible models of normal registration practice. The registers sit in the archives, available to researchers with the time and resources to examine them systematically. The institutional records, where they survive, are also available, though often incomplete due to fire, flood, and deliberate destruction. The methodological tools for analyzing historical vital statistics are well established and taught in graduate programs in demography and historical sociology. The questions are researchable. What is required is not new methods or new permissions, but the sustained archival labor of examining enough registers across enough colonies and enough years to establish whether the pattern is as widespread and consistent as impressionistic reading suggests, whether it differs in frequency or kind from comparable patterns in other settler colonial societies with similar demographic features, and whether it can be adequately explained by documented social and administrative factors. Until that work is done, claims about the pattern being anomalous or requiring extraordinary explanation remain premature. The possibility that systematic study will reveal something genuinely unusual remains open. Historical research occasionally does overturn settled understandings, but the burden of proof rests with those claiming something unusual, and that proof must take the form of systematic evidence, not impressionistic pattern matching or rhetorical suggestion of mysteries requiring resolution.